Flights of Rhetoric, a brief video on how to organize a rhetorical analysis. Most of us are likely most familiar with the kind of essay structure that's often taught in high schools, the 5-paragraph essay. You probably know it well. You start with an introduction that forecasts all that you're going to say in the body of the essay. Then in that introduction, you also have a thesis where you list 3 supporting reasons for your argument. Then you have 3 body paragraphs, 1 per each reason. And then a conclusion that summarizes everything you've said one more time. Now, this structure can be useful in certain situations, like a timed essay exam, where you want to be able to keep your thoughts organized without having to overthink the organization. But besides those very rare situations that format best applies, from here on out, we want to avoid the 5-paragraph essay format. For one thing, it's too much of a formula, as if all writing situations were the same. And we know just from the past couple of weeks that that's not the case. Different writing situations require different approaches. So we don't want to act as if there is one formula that fits all. Also, complex topics, the kinds of things you're going to be writing about for the rest of college, they're not going to be easily reduced to only 3 supporting points. Sometimes they might have a lot more. Sometimes they might just have fewer. So we don't want to treat it as if all essays have to fit with that somewhat random number of supporting reasons. Also, when we have a thesis that forecasts all of your supporting reasons, a reader doesn't actually have to read the essay to feel that they already know what you were going to say. And sometimes that might be accurate, in which case the introduction is all they need and the rest of the essay doesn't matter. That's probably why it can sometimes feel like there's no purpose to writing that kind of essay. But also, you can have times where the audience might not agree with you. And if they don't agree with you and you give them your reasons before walking them through the logic and drawing connections, they could just dismiss your argument completely before even reading your essay. They don't even give you a chance to make your case. So we want to avoid that kind of forecasting 3-pronged thesis. Also, with a conclusion that only summarizes the main points of the essay, it becomes a throwaway paragraph. We just read your essay, not minutes ago, right? So why would we need a paragraph that only tells us the things we've already been told? So we want to move away from that structure that we've known so well. But, and the reason I'm saying all of this, is that in any piece of essay writing, regardless of its purpose, regardless of its length, it is still going to have an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. So even though we're moving away from that 5-paragraph essay format, we still want to think about the introduction and what it does, the body and what it does, and the conclusion and what it does. I think about it kind of like a flight on an airplane. Regardless of how far away you're going, the plane still has to take off. That's the introduction. It still has to fly. That's the body. And it still has to land. And that's the conclusion. So let's talk about how your essay takes off, flies, and lands when what you're doing is a rhetorical analysis. We'll start with the introduction. Again, because we're not doing a 5-paragraph essay format, please note that when we're talking about introductions, we're talking about a part of the essay, not just necessarily one paragraph. Now, it may be one paragraph, particularly in shorter essays, but introductions can also be quite long. If you think about books, sometimes the introduction to a textbook might be a whole chapter. Just think of introductions as whatever is necessary to get the plane off the ground. So here are a few things you're going to need to do in your introduction of a rhetorical analysis. The first thing is that you want to name the title and author in the first few lines. If you are analyzing a text, we need to know that very early on, and we need to know what text it is. I think for many of us in an essay as relatively short as our rhetorical analyses will be, that means introducing the title and the author in the first sentence. It's a good reminder that we don't want our introductions to start too broad. We want to be focused on the issue at hand right from the beginning, particularly, again, when the essay is relatively short. So we need to know those things up front. Then we also need context for the work. Here are a few things, a few questions you might answer to give us context. What is the rhetorical situation surrounding this text? What is its setting? Thinking about all the terms we have been studying in the last couple weeks, thinking about which of those are most relevant. Who is the communicator? What do we know about this author? And who is their intended audience? Also with that is, how do you know that's their intended audience? What about the text, its placement, its language tells you that this is who you think they're going after? What is the communicator's message? And what are their goals for the text? In other words, what do they want out of their audience? And how does the communicator achieve this purpose? What tools are used? You can think about these as what appeals are used or what strategies of the appeals. For instance, you might say that someone uses a lot of personal stories about the topic, and that maybe both builds up their ethos and their pathos. So they are the tools used in order to appeal to emotion or appeal to credibility. Also, we know that an introduction does need to include a thesis. A thesis is that 1 or 2 sentence concise communication of your arguable position. Your analysis is a form of argument, and a thesis is where we need to communicate that clearly. Think about it this way. Thesis statements exist both to be a guide for readers, so they know where all of this is headed, what we're trying to support and prove, and also a guide to you, to remind you of what you're always trying to say. And we like it to be brief because that's a way we make sure that the thought that you're trying to present is clear and thought through. If you can't communicate your thesis in a single sentence or 2, then that's usually a sign that the argument is much more complex or cloudy than we really want, right? It tells us that maybe you're not quite sure what you're wanting to argue. So by pushing yourself to put it in a thesis, you help clarify your own thinking and guide your own writing. We want thesis statements to be specific. So we want them to focus on specific elements. They need to be arguable. So in other words, remember that we don't want a statement of fact. If you just said, this person wrote this article and used pathos, that's a statement of fact. That doesn't necessarily, or in that case, would not make an argument. We need to make an argument about how, why, and how well those different tools and rhetorical strategies are used. It needs to be supportable, meaning you do have reasons for supporting your position, the kinds of things we're going to look at in the body. It needs to be easy to identify, which means your readers need to be able to tell that that sentence is the one that's most important for directing our focus. That's why in most, particularly shorter essays, like the one we're doing, the thesis is typically the last sentence of the introduction. We will discuss times where that's not the way you do it, but for this rhetorical analysis, I recommend having your thesis as the last sentence of your introduction. That gives it some rhythmic emphasis because we say it and then we take a break, which is kind of like underlining it before we go on to the body. And it also means that when we jump into your supporting evidence, the last thing we read was your thesis. So your argument is very much on our mind. We want to avoid that three-pronged formula where you merely tell us the point you're going to make. So let me give you an example, and we'll look at more elsewhere. But here's kind of an example template that you could use as a thesis. The parts that are in brackets, those are the parts that you would add in what it is what is relevant to your text. So the communicator uses what rhetorical elements to effectively or ineffectively, choosing one of those is what makes it arguable, right? Because somebody else might think it was ineffective, even if you were arguing that it was effective. To persuade their intended audience, naming who that intended audience is, to do what? Are they trying to get them to protest? Are they trying to get them to, not buy things online anymore? What is it that they're trying to do? What do they want their audience to do? These things are what you want to do in the introduction. Once you've given us that thesis, well, then you can move into the body. This is when the airplane is just in the air flying. Couple things about body paragraphs, and many of these apply to any type of writing, not just rhetorical analysis. These are just the way we approach writing body paragraphs. First, remember that each paragraph should be focused around a distinct topic or point. When the topic shifts, a new paragraph begins. Think of paragraph breaks as breaths in a conversation. They're signals. They tell us, all right, here, we're moving to something else. Now, we want the paragraphs to be related to one another, and we may need transitions between them, which would mean starting a new paragraph with a transitional statement. But you want to think about that transition as telling readers that you're changing the topic. Topic sentences can help. Topic sentences typically come at the beginning of a new paragraph, and they are where you state the point you're going to make in that paragraph. One reason that topic sentences can help so much is that they allow you to evaluate whether all the other sentences in that paragraph are on that topic. Any sentences that aren't supporting that topic would therefore go to another part of the essay. And remember, if your topic sentences are transitioning, if you're giving us transitional language to explain how the 2 points are connected, the transitions belong at the beginning of new paragraphs, not at the end of the previous paragraph. So put them at the beginning of new paragraphs, not at the end of the paragraph you're finishing. These paragraphs should provide clear evidence and examples from the text to illustrate your logic. Think of it as support. These are the pieces of evidence that you are using to illustrate and prove your individual points. And then remember that you also need to explain how and why the evidence and examples support your overall claim about the text's effectiveness at meeting its intended audience and purpose. In other words, you're going to make a claim and give us evidence to support that claim, but you don't want to assume that we are going to draw the connection between the evidence and the claim on our own. You have to explain it. How does that piece of evidence support the claim of that individual paragraph? And how does that individual paragraph support the overall claim of your essay? Remember that everyone's brain works a little bit differently, which is why the world is awesome and it's cool to meet new people. But because everybody's brain works a little bit differently, you don't want to rely on our drawing the connections for you. Because if you do, and we aren't able to draw them, then we won't be persuaded by your argument, nor will we understand your logic. But if you explain it, then even if we wouldn't have reached that conclusion on our own, we can understand how you reached it. Couple of warnings with rhetorical analysis body paragraphs. Don't just summarize what the text says. Remember, we're going to act as if your named audience has some familiarity with this text. They have read it already. So you don't want to focus on telling them what the source says. Instead, you want to be focused on how well, and why, or why the text does what it does. So we're not summarizing. We're also not just identifying appeals. We don't just want to say, look, there, I found pathos. Those are just identifications. Those identifications are supporting your argument, but they are not enough on their own. So if you say, look, this is pathos, then you have to tell us why and how that pathos affects the text's overall effectiveness at reaching its audience. So remember, I might not, if I say, look, there's a lot of data in that essay, there's a lot of facts and figures and things like that, I'm just pointing to them there. But if I explain how and why facts and figures are helpful at reaching this particular audience, then I am using that example to support my claim that the text is effective. I am not just pointing out the appeals. Let's look at an example. This is a body paragraph from an example rhetorical analysis. I'm going to read it to you, and then I want to point out what it's doing. Brooks overcomes his limitations in logos and ethos through his piece's greatest strength, its style. He effectively frames cultural messages in binaries in order to reinforce the disconnect that exists between what students are told and what they will face as full members of society. Throughout his piece, he states one assumption after another, then prompts us to consider its opposite. Serious things immediately take the place of rapturous talk. Looking inside replaces looking outside. Suppressing yourself becomes an alternative to being independent-minded. Brooks' argument is consumed with dichotomies, culminating with his statement, "It's excellence, not happiness, that we admire most." He frames his ideas within a tight framework of repetition and parallel structure, creating muscular prose intended to engage his readers. His repeated use of the phrase, "but of course," serves as a metronomic reminder, at once echoing his earlier assertions and referring back to his air of authority. All right, let's look at the parts of this body paragraph. And don't worry if you don't understand all of it. It is, of course, taken from the middle of an essay that you haven't read. So just look at the parts of this paragraph, even if we don't know anything about what it is saying. So first, we get that sentence that presents, the topic sentence that presents the point of the paragraph. Brooks overcomes his limitations in logos and ethos through his piece's greatest strength, its style. That sentence tells us that the paragraph is going to focus on style. And even though we haven't read the previous paragraph, the beginning of it, saying he overcomes his limitations in logos and ethos, that implies to us that the previous paragraphs were about those limitations in logos and ethos. So we get the transitional language and we get the topic of this paragraph. Then we get some evidence from the text itself. I've highlighted it here. The quoted passages, serious things, rapturous talk, looking inside. All these quotes are evidence directly from the text to illustrate the claim that the writer is making. But the writer doesn't stop there. They end the paragraph by talking about why that stuff matters. They say he's crafting muscular prose intended to engage his readers. That's what he's doing. The repetition, that ties back to what he was doing elsewhere. These last couple of sentences tell us how this individual look at style relates to the rest of the essay.